You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 31st of July, 2024, on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, as Israel conducts strikes on Hezbollah and Hamas leaders in Tehran and Beirut, we'll examine the burgeoning regional conflict. Then, at least 11 people have died in protests against the election results in Venezuela. The German defence ministers in the Indo-Pacific will ask about the country's increased presence on the global military stage. We'll hear why Hungary is being accused of jeopardising security for the whole of Europe and what Ukrainian soldiers are up to in Mali. We'll have a flick through the day's front pages and then...
Meloni finds herself stuck between the EU and this specific business category. Even if this might sound like a very specific niche part of business, it's not really. It's really, really big money.
We turn our focus to Italy's sunbed wars. And finally, we'll check in with our team in Paris. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. China's ruling Communist Party has expelled Wang Yilin, former chairman and party secretary of state-owned China National Petroleum Corporation, for discipline violations. That's according to state media this morning. Ukraine's air defence systems destroyed more than 30 drones over Kyiv that Russia launched overnight, the military administration of the Ukrainian capital said on the Telegram messaging app. And a number of Russian dissidents and people convicted for their opposition to Moscow's war in Ukraine have disappeared from Russian prisons in recent days, in what rights activists say is a possible sign that a prisoner swap with the West may be close. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Iran earlier today, the Palestinian militant group and Iran's elite Revolutionary Guards said in separate statements blaming Israel. Earlier, Israel carried out a strike on southern Beirut, targeting a senior Hezbollah commander they claimed was responsible for the murder of children. Well, Ruth Michelson is a journalist based in Istanbul. She's just returned from Jerusalem, and she joins us now to unpick what's been happening. Ruth, many thanks for coming on the show this morning. I wonder if you could talk us through this attack on Ismail Haniyeh. Who was he?
So Ismail Haniyeh was the former leader of the Hamas Politburo, the political wing of Hamas. He had lived in exile in Doha, in Qatar for about 5 years. And he was really seen as someone that was extremely important in terms of diplomacy. He was often seen shuttling between Doha, Iran, Turkey. And he was also considered extremely important to ceasefire talks. He was someone who was seen as a key line of communication into the more hardline elements, like Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas in Gaza. And so this assassination is, among other things, I mean, this is seen as symbolic of the idea that there is very unlikely to be a ceasefire deal anytime soon.
Now, it took place in Tehran. How significant is that actually it's on Iranian territory?
I think it's enormously significant. I mean, we've seen Israel has been accused of assassinating different figures inside Tehran in the past. But at the same time, Haniyeh was in Tehran for the inauguration of the new president, Masoud Pezeshkian. And the last images of him were standing next to a model of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock. And you know, the fact that he was in Tehran for the inauguration of this new president, he was there with the leaders of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, other factions, the second in command of Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, for this enormous event. This will be significant to Iran because a key ally has just been assassinated in their capital as a new president has been inaugurated. And so we've already seen statements from the Iranians. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson saying that Haniyeh's blood will never be wasted. He actually said that the fact that he was killed in Tehran will strengthen the unbreakable bond between Tehran, Palestine, and Hezbollah. And there have also been statements on Iranian state television saying that this will delay the ceasefire in Gaza by several months, and that there is the potential to prompt a retaliation from militant groups across the region. So that would be groups like Hezbollah that are backed by Iran.
And has Israel actually claimed responsibility for this attack?
No, we haven't seen any claim of responsibility for this attack so far by the Israelis. That's somewhat in keeping with what we've seen in the past, that when we've seen previous assassinations carried out on Iranian soil, even though Iran has blamed Israel for these, and other actors have assumed that the Israelis would be the most likely culprit for this. And Israel has also said that they will go after every Hamas leader anywhere. We saw that with the killing of Saleh Arouri earlier this year in Beirut. But it would be in keeping with what Israel has done in the past not to claim this, even though everything would suggest that they were the ones responsible.
Looking at this attack also in southern Beirut, what was the situation there?
Well, we've just seen that Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group, have basically acknowledged the strike that took place yesterday in Dahir, or near Dahir, in the southern suburbs of Beirut. And what they've said is that they have acknowledged that Fouad Shakur, a major commander within Hezbollah, was targeted in the strike. They said he was present in the building at the time, but they did not acknowledge his death, and so this suggests that he is still alive, because Hezbollah normally states openly when their fighters have been killed. This is someone who had a $5 million bounty on his head from America. He was alleged to have had a role in the bombing of an American barracks in Beirut in 1983. And we were already seeing furious reactions last night from Lebanon. The Lebanese foreign minister had previously said that he was in shock. He told The Guardian, because he believed that the Israelis had sort of succumbed to pressure from allies like the US to agree to a more limited response to the Hezbollah rocket attack that occurred over the weekend, which hit the occupied Golan Heights.
Is this not an example of it being more limited, though? I mean, are both Hezbollah and Israel mindful of not escalating this? And that being the case, then why go and carry out an attack within Iran?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the question after the rocket attack on the Golan Heights was, how would Israel manage to calibrate a precise response that would respond to this strike, which killed 12 children, but at the same time not escalate in such a way that it could result in a wider war. We saw warnings from every party involved. President Emmanuel Macron getting on the phone with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to try and tamp down these tensions. Iran was also involved in this kind of frantic diplomacy that we saw after that strike. And so there was a huge question mark over how Israel might select a target that would respond to this rocket attack, but that wouldn't inflame tensions. Well, you could say that by definition, choosing to strike anywhere or anyone in Beirut would be an escalation. There were already reported warnings from the White House telling Israel that they felt that any target in Beirut would be an escalation. But they chose a commander that they said was responsible for planning the rocket strike. We don't have confirmation of that. So now, on top of this, the attack or the suspected assassination in Tehran, that would appear to be a major escalation. I mean, now that has completely changed everything. The idea that the fears that we are seeing and the reports, condemnation, just for one example from the Turkish foreign ministry, calling this as heinous, warning of the potential for a wider war. And this is now the prevailing concern across the region.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed for that. I'm sure we'll be following this story as it unfolds further. That's Ruth Michelson speaking to us from Istanbul. And this is The Globalist. It's 8:10 in Zurich, and that means it's 2:10 a.m. in Caracas. At least 11 people are known to have died in the violent protests that have broken out in Venezuela after authorities declared Nicolás Maduro as the winner of Sunday's election. The opposition say they have proof that the result is false. Those countries that agree with the populist foreign policy and anti-imperialist rhetoric of the Bolivarian revolution that Maduro has been promoting since he came to power in 2013 have congratulated him. But there's also been an outcry from some Latin American countries, the US and Europe. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves and once boasted Latin America's most advanced economy. But after Maduro took the helm, it tumbled into a freefall, marked by plummeting oil prices, widespread shortages of basic goods and hyperinflation of 130,000%. Some 7.7 million Venezuelans, or a third of the population, have fled the crisis-stricken nation. Well, I'm joined now by Andrew Thompson, who's a journalist and political risk analyst specialising in Latin America. Andrew, I wonder if we could start with the numbers. What do the authorities say and what proof do the opposition have?
That's quite interesting. The opposition say they have the returns from individual polling stations for about 80% of the vote. They've actually physically got, copies of these documents, and they say that this shows that the opposition candidate was leading by about 70% versus 30% of the vote going towards President Maduro. On that basis, they say that what the government is saying, that Maduro won with 51%, is mathematically impossible. And at the moment, they seem in the propaganda war, if you want to call it that, the opposition seems to have the upper hand because it is saying to the government, if you disagree with this, present the detailed polling station returns, and we'll try and reconcile the figures. The government has claimed lots of things. It's claimed that there's a cyber attack on the electronic voting system. It claims there's been a right-wing coup in preparation, but it hasn't actually produced these polling station returns, which the opposition is saying, until you do that, the election is illegitimate.
And of course, that sparked protests. Can you bring us up to speed on what's happening on the streets?
Yes, essentially what's happened is partly supported by the opposition leadership, but partly because of a spontaneous explosion of frustration. There are demonstrations and clashes across the country. Still not sort of massive by Venezuelan standards, but significant. As you pointed out, 11 people have died. There are something like 750 people have been arrested. The government is saying that some police forces have suffered injuries. This is likely to continue and may even escalate, simply because such a large proportion of the population feels it is essentially fed up with the economic crisis, with hyperinflation, with low wages, and what is seen as a refusal to allow freedom, allow fair and free elections, which would somehow put Venezuela on the road to recovery.
I mean, members of the military must feel like that too. Is there any chance that they might side with protesters?
This is probably the most important question to ask in the middle of the current Venezuelan crisis. It looks as if the high command, and particularly the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, General Vladimir Padrino, it looks as if that group of the armed forces is solidly behind Maduro and not ready to make any concessions. However, it is possible that some generals might break away and begin to negotiate with the opposition movement. And it's also possible that much lower levels in the armed forces may begin to turn against the government. There's been no sign of that as yet, but it is, if you like, what a lot of analysts are looking for. People who, lower ranks of the military, if you like, share the deprivation of Venezuelan society as a whole. So they too get paid very, very low wages and have reason to be unhappy. So the question is, does any part of the armed forces change sides and begin negotiations, which would be, along the lines of the military saying, we will accept the new president-elect, we will accept that the opposition won, if in turn we are protected from prosecution over criminal activity, human rights violations, and things of that type.
And are there back-channel negotiations going on, possibly between the US and Maduro? Could there be a dignified off-ramp for him, or do you think he'll double down?
I think it's likely that negotiations are being conducted at the moment. The United States is leading a general condemnation of Venezuela by Latin American countries. There is today going to be an emergency meeting of the Organization of American States. And just to remind you, the Venezuelan government has expelled the ambassadors of Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Peru, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Uruguay. So there is quite a strong diplomatic move against Venezuela and refusal to recognize the elections as legitimate. There are some key countries in this. Brazil is likely to be playing a key role. It hasn't yet pronounced itself. And the Brazilian officials are said to be in talks with their US counterparts on what type of approach they might have towards this. So it's likely that the international dimension will be to condemn illegitimate elections, fraudulent elections, but to try and favor the reopening of negotiations and the possibilities of some kind of an outcome. It's also worth mentioning that the new president under the Venezuelan constitution doesn't take office until January next year. So there's quite a long period in which it is likely we will have two people both claiming to have won the elections, and which will be, if you like, a combination of protest demonstrations and behind closed doors negotiations going on at the same time.
How far does this show the deep ideological divides within Latin America?
To some extent it does. Latin America has got some quite polarized positions between right-wing and left-wing governments, and there's a kind of pendular movement. So it is important, but I think it should also be said that from a kind of a non-ideological point of view, elections are important, and there is a degree of common ground between left and right, or between, I should say, moderate left and right, that the best way out of the Venezuelan crisis is through fair and free elections. So you get, for example, just to give one example, the Chilean government, which is moderately left-wing, has been at the forefront of condemning Venezuela, while other more hard-left governments, particularly Cuba and Nicaragua, have been very quick to recognize Maduro's re-election and to basically say that anything untoward in Venezuela is the work of, right-wing pro-US coup mongers.
And just looking at the wider global effect of another Maduro leadership of the country, is there concern that given the potential bigger conflict brewing with Russia, Vladimir Putin's access to cheap oil through Venezuela could be hugely significant?
It could be significant. The problem is that the Venezuelan oil and gas sector is in such a state of chaos that its ability to produce oil for Russia or for anyone else is quite limited. We're talking about a country that had an annual production of around 3 million plus barrels per day. And that is now probably down to around 800,000. And that's a result of years and years of zero investment in the country's oil and gas infrastructure. So a lot of pipelines are faulty, ports and tankers are in a very bad state of repair. So that's quite difficult for the government to take ahead. And in a sense, it's deeply ironic. The country with the largest oil and gas reserves in the world seems to be unable to take much advantage out of them.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. That's Andrew Thompson there. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
Well, the Olympic Games are in full swing now. The city's ablaze with energy and action. I'm Emma Nelson, and a little later I'll look ahead to today's episode of Monocle in Paris. We'll be talking about fusing fashion and sport, the city's long-term strategy for the people who live here, and why in the middle of a heat wave we should all pull on our woolies and sign up for a winter pentathlon.
We'll be speaking to Emma a little bit later on in the programme. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Chris Chermak, Monocle Radio's senior news editor. I guess you're my boss, really, aren't you?
I hadn't thought about it that way. I don't want to think about it that way, Georgina. You're such a wonderful host. You do what you like, and that's wonderful.
Thank you. Okay, so let me tell you what I've learned. Let's talk about the US, because obviously you have a vested interest in that, and it is such an interesting time. Could you give us a bit of a campaign roundup?
There is so much going on, as there is every day at the moment in this campaign, and so I have a few stories from the US to bring you from the campaign. The first one is that from Politico, that Kamala Harris is planning a battleground tour with her running mate next week. So the campaign has essentially announced quietly that from Tuesday she will be campaigning in Philadelphia, starting on Tuesday. We don't actually know who the running mate is yet, so it's quite funny to have an actual sort of story of a battleground tour without the actual running mate being said. That said, the fact that it starts in Philadelphia has some people, at least, pointing to Pennsylvania's Governor Josh Shapiro. He would be somebody from a battleground state who would help Kamala Harris with her campaign in the U.S., but they will also be going to western Wisconsin, Detroit, Raleigh, North Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada. So they're going to do a big tour. Clearly, there's going to be an announcement relatively soon. We just don't know exactly when.
Mm-hmm. Now, Trump's made some odd remarks that Harris won't be palatable to foreign leaders. What did he say?
Yeah, so Donald Trump appeared on Fox, on Laura Ingraham, and one of the things he said in trying to sort of knock Kamala Harris down, he said that for foreign leaders, quote, she'll be like a play toy. They look at her and they say, "We can't believe we got so lucky." They're going to walk all over her. And then in this very ominous way, apparently he turned directly to the camera and said, "I don't want to say as to why, but a lot of people understand it."
What does that mean?
Always in this cryptic way that Donald Trump does, right? Of course, there are accusations of sexism, of racism here. He, of course, is denying that. His campaign is denying that. But the way that he does this and suggests that Kamala Harris will not be taken seriously on the world stage obviously has people talking. This is what he does, right? This is his way of acting, to say something like this without actually saying it. So he has plausible deniability, if you will, while still offering that dog whistle to some of his supporters.
Now, the whole cat lady thing is still looming large. This was his vice presidential pick, Vance, J.D. Vance, who spoke about Kamala being a childless cat lady. But many of them have come together to support Harris.
Well, I love this story for sort of both sides of this. On the one hand, cat ladies coming together, and on the other hand, just all of the groups that are coming together on the Democratic side to support Kamala Harris in a series of Zoom calls that are either raising funding or organizing. And so this is the latest Zoom call. We've had the cat ladies Zoom call organized by Christine Pelosi, who's the daughter of Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House of Representatives. It's organized by a group called Pet Lovers for Harris. They wanted to be, or initially were going to be, the organizers, cat ladies for Harris, if you will, then realized that they had an affinity among dog owners as well, and so they broadened their approach. A big tent of pet owners, if you will. And yes, they organized a Zoom call last night for support. And this follows on a number of these Zoom calls. We also had a big one that was making waves yesterday called White Dudes for Harris, which raised about $4 million for Kamala Harris's campaign.
Which is extraordinary. Now, J.D. Vance, that's not the only unfortunate thing he's said or done. One of the other things he's done is been seen to really back Project 2025. He, in fact, wrote, I think, the intro to a book by the person who has designed Project 2025, if you like. But there's been a change in direction now.
Well, there has been a change in direction. Project 2025 was written by the Heritage Foundation, or coordinated. This is a sort of conservative think tank in the United States. And the director of the project, Paul Dance, is now departing. He is a former Trump administration official. That said, this has been such an interesting and bizarre fight because Donald Trump and his campaign have tried to distance themselves from Project 2025 because it's really taken on a life of its own. Democrats sort of grabbed this template that Project 2025 is supposed to be for the first 180 days of an administration. And they grabbed it to such an extent that Donald Trump has had to distance himself and say, this was not my platform. I had nothing to do with it. I don't know what's in it. I don't know who was there, despite the fact that many of his own campaign officials, people close to him, have worked on it. This fight has gotten so bizarre and nasty that some, in the Trump officials have even suggested that anyone who participated in Project 2025 could not join an administration if Donald Trump were to be elected. That includes, though, Stephen Miller, Peter Navarro, very close advisors to Donald Trump. So it's hard to imagine that actually happening.
And J.D. Vance.
J.D. Vance writing the foreword to the book, exactly. So everyone's sort of suddenly running away from this project. The Heritage Foundation says, well, this was just natural that he leaves because, we've reached the end of our work. It's out there. But nonetheless, it shows just how much of a problem this Project 2025 has become.
Absolutely. Right, let's go further afield and have a look at Japan. And there's some quite good news.
There is some quite good news. I'm putting on my economics hat. I once was an economics reporter, Georgina, and Japan has raised interest rates for the first time above 0% since 2007. So this goes back a long way, all the way back when I was covering the financial crisis in 2007. Interest rates have been so low in Japan, and it's kind of led because other countries have been raising interest rates recently with all the price increases that we've had. It's led to the yen falling to like a 37-year low against the dollar, which basically means that everybody and their mother has been traveling to Japan because it's wonderful to go there right now for tourism. But that said, Japan is now raising its rate to 0.25%. They say inflation is back under control in Japan, as in it's hitting their 2% mark. So prices are finally rising easing a bit in Japan, and that's what's led to this move by the Japanese central bank to finally push interest rates up a little bit.
And let's have a look at the Olympics.
Well, there's a few stories I can bring you from the Olympics. One serious, one less serious, if you will, but one from a really interesting story out of the U.S. Lawmakers yesterday held a press conference essentially threatening to withhold money from the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA. And this is a bizarre fight over the U.S. essentially wanting to investigate doping in China. There was apparently doping allegations of athletes back from 2021 that was withheld, that was kept quiet by the World Anti-Doping Agency. This has become a very bizarre fight. The U.S. has wanted to investigate these doping allegations, and the World Anti-Doping Agency and the Olympic Committee, as a result, has basically said, stay away from this, don't investigate. If you do, we will remove Salt Lake City 2034 from the Olympic calendar. So basically, Salt Lake City was given the Olympics for the Winter Olympics in 2034, and there is language in that contract to say if you investigate WADA, we will potentially remove Salt Lake City as a host city. U.S. lawmakers are now going back against that and saying we are going to take money away from WADA if you do that.
Quite extraordinary. Give us the good news story from the Olympics.
Just the final one, just in terms of results from yesterday. Obviously, in the U.S., Simone Biles is the real huge star that everyone is talking about.
Did you watch her yesterday?
She won the gold medals. I did watch. It was quite an incredible
amazing,
performance.
wasn't she? Yeah.
She was amazing. The whole team was amazing. The fact that they won the gold 8 years after she won her first gold is just an incredible story. But I did also want to end with here in the UK. What about Andy Murray, the tennis star? He is on his retirement tour. This could be his last tournament at the Olympics. He's in the doubles, and he is now twice, with Dan Evans, his partner, pulled back from the brink, facing match points in his games. And still, nonetheless, winning his matches, going on to the quarterfinals of the tennis. Wouldn't it be nice for Andy Murray to win one more medal at these Olympics? He does already have 3.
Excellent stuff. Chris, thank you very much indeed. That's Chris Chermak. And now here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. China's ruling Communist Party has expelled Wang Yilin, former chairman and party secretary of state-owned China National Petroleum Corporation, for discipline violations, state media said this morning. Ukraine's air defense systems destroyed more than 30 drones over Kyiv that Russia launched overnight, the military administration of the Ukrainian capital said on the Telegram messaging app. And a number of Russian dissidents and people convicted for their opposition to Moscow's war in Ukraine have disappeared from Russian prisons in recent days, in what rights activists say is a possible sign that a prisoner swap with the West may be close. In Belarus, President Alexander Lukashenko has pardoned Rico Krieger, a German citizen sentenced to death on terrorism charges, again with unusual haste and state media coverage. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Yesterday, the German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius arrived in the US state of Hawaii at the start of a tour of the Indo-Pacific region. The German Navy is participating in the US-led Naval Rim of the Pacific, or RIMPAC, military exercise with a frigate and an operations group supply ship for the first time. The exercise takes place every 2 years, involving 29 nations, including France and Britain, as well as some 40 ships, planes and helicopters. This follows Germany's increased concern over an increasingly aggressive China, which also remains Germany's biggest trading partner. Well, Dr. Eileen Matley is a research fellow at the Centre for Security and Defence and joins us now from Berlin. Eileen, many thanks for coming on the programme. In 2020, the German cabinet established guidelines for the country's policy in the Indo-Pacific. It highlighted its central importance for the global and the German economy, and it outlined associated risks. Now, last year, this was followed by the country's first ever national security strategy, which reiterated that the Indo-Pacific remains of special significance to Germany and Europe. And at the same time, the tone of the German government towards China has become much tougher, as indicated by Germany's 2023 strategy, security strategy, that is. What are the broad outlines of these policies? How do they all work together, and what do they tell us about this current situation?
Good morning. So I think what we can see from 2020 until now is a sort of a development in understanding and developing a greater understanding of the role China plays in its region, in its neighborhood, but also more broadly in the world. Obviously, that ties back to China's support of Russia since Russia's renewed and large-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I think it is dawning on more and more policymakers and decision makers in Germany that China is not only a trading partner, but also has a malign influence on European security via supporting Russia and via having Russia's back, having had its back since 2022. So I think in sum, we're just seeing a sort of a gradual evolvement of understanding of what kind of player China is, rather than what Germany would like China to be.
I mean, is there a bit of a balancing act then to be done there? I mean, how can Germany signal to its partners its willingness to be more engaged in the Indo-Pacific while simultaneously telling China that its mission is not about confrontation?
Certainly, it is about walking a very fine line, especially for Germany. You mentioned already the vast amount of trade that Germany is engaged in with China. But at the same time, Germany is also in very practical terms signaling to its partners via, for example, this year again, the Indo-Pacific deployment, that it is serious about showing support of the rules-based international order, of which freedom of navigation operations are a huge part of. And that obviously serves to bolster open sea lanes, which are necessary in order for international trade to take place. And much of that trade is passing through the Indo-Pacific waters. And there are also other engagements that Germany has been engaged in recent years on a bilateral level, with, for example, like-minded partners like Japan, like South Korea, like the Philippines, like Australia and New Zealand. And at the same time, Germany is very keen on sort of signaling to China, on the one hand, that Germany is supporting the rules-based international order and everything that goes along with it, but also making sure that it is not about containing China, or at least it's not saying so openly. I would say that's my interpretation in the sort of the read, or like looking at all the engagement that Germany is part of. It obviously is also trying to signal towards China that it should not cross certain lines.
Mm. And with these two German ships in the Indo-Pacific, will they traverse contested water around China, and might they transit the Taiwan Strait?
Well, that is the very big question that is looming over the Indo-Pacific deployment this year. Last time around, Germany chose not to pass through the Taiwan Strait. This year, I mean, we've heard a couple of statements coming from the foreign minister, for example, Annalena Baerbock, just a couple of weeks ago, where she hinted at the possibility of the frigate and the supply ship passing through the Taiwan Strait. And Germany's defense minister, in a very similar vein, made similar comments, but it's not yet decided. And I think it's especially the Chancellery and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who is opposed to pursuing that course.
Mm. And just quickly before we go, we know that Germany's also boosted other defence ties in Europe. Pistorius was in Norway. He also met the UK's Defence Secretary in Berlin before this trip. I wonder what these meetings tell us about what's driving Germany's increased military presence on the global stage and what its overall aims are.
I think the overall aim at the moment is to make sure that Ukraine is not defeated by Russia. It is about contributing a much larger share to conventional deterrence and defense in Europe. But I think it is also about signaling that Germany is cognizant of its role in the world, and that that role cannot be limited to Europe alone, while, and that I think must be emphasized, the major role that Germany can play in military terms lies in Europe and not in the Indo-Pacific.
Dr. Aylan Matleh, thank you very much indeed. You're with Monocle Radio. It is 8:39 in Budapest, 7:39 here in London. Viktor Orban of Hungary is the European Union's longest-serving leader and currently holds the rotating presidency of the EU Council. He's been widely criticised by the bloc for his dealings with Russia, including unofficial meetings with Vladimir Putin and his refusal to provide Kyiv with weapons. And now he's announced fast-track visa services without security checks or other restrictions for 8 countries, including Russia and Belarus, which the European People's Party, the EPP, says could allow spies to enter the EU and the Schengen zone. Well, I'm joined now by Jenny Mathers, who's a Russia specialist and a senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University. Jenny, welcome back to the show. How much of a security risk is this to the rest of Europe? How would it work and why does it matter?
So I think it matters because most of the rest of the European countries have really cracked down on issuing visas to Russian citizens since the start of the mass invasion in 2022. And, in some countries, they have simply suspended giving visas to Russian citizens at all. In other cases, they have made the process longer, more bureaucratic, more expensive. But the key is that when Russian citizens are issued with visas to come to the EU, they are subjected to a lot more stringent security measures and a lot more stringent scrutiny. And this is what the EU itself has recommended. So by opening up the door, basically, to Russian citizens to have visas without any sort of security scrutiny, Hungary is potentially opening the door to who knows who might come through on a Russian visa, ostensibly to work on nuclear power plants. But in fact, it could be a cover for intelligence. So indeed, I think this is a valid concern which is being raised, and it fits with or it's consistent with the behavior of Hungary under Viktor Orban in recent years.
Why has he done this?
Well, I think it's part and parcel of his overall orientation towards Russia and towards Putin. Orban and Putin share a lot of common interests, common concerns, common values. Orban is also someone who is very concerned about sort of Western decadence and LGBT rights and so on, and concerned about traditional values. He sees himself as a strong man. He sees himself as being a sort of a Putin light, if you like. So I think there's a lot of common interest there, and clearly there's material benefits that Hungary is getting from Russia. There's close economic ties, and it's another way of really supporting Russia and enabling Russia to do potentially the things that it wants to do in Europe.
And Russians are not only travelling to Europe, they're also in parts of Africa. And it looks like Ukrainians might be there too. Ukrainian military intelligence says it was involved in an ambush in Mali that killed fighters from Russia's Wagner group. So the Mali government requested help from Wagner after a military junta took power back in 2020. What more do we know about this Ukrainian presence there, Jenny?
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting because the Ukrainians have said, basically hinted that they provided important intelligence for the rebels who are fighting against the government in Mali, and that this intelligence enabled the rebels to successfully ambush a Wagner Group contingent and killed perhaps as many as 80 Wagner Group fighters. The numbers are still unclear. It's certainly the biggest, defeat, if you like, of a Wagner Group mission in Africa in recent years. And it is, it reflects the fact that the war in Ukraine is not simply limited to Ukraine. It's not simply limited to Europe, but it's having much further reaching implications, which are stretching around the world. And as Russia seeks to expand and entrench its influence in various African countries through Wagner Group in particular, Ukraine is seeing an opportunity to hit Russia in other places, not only in Ukraine and behind the lines in Russia, but also to go after its other interests. And by making some sort of a marriage of convenience, perhaps, with these rebels in Mali, it can inflict some damage on Russia.
And Wagner's also in Sudan, and there are reports that Ukrainian soldiers are fighting them there too. Is this war then taking on a global dimension, as you suggest? I mean, when do we actually call it a world war?
Well, we're possibly not quite there yet, but certainly there has been this global dimension almost from the beginning, really, because when Russia failed to seize Kyiv and take control of the whole of the country back in 2022, it was clear that it was going to reach out to try to expand its supporters around the world to try and reduce Ukraine's ability to have its own economic links, and so you had the blockades of Ukrainian ports, an attempt to sort of shut off Ukrainian trade in grain and so on. So I think we're already have seen for quite a long time, a real significant range of global implications. And I think this, apparent involvement of Ukrainians in Africa is another step in that direction. I don't think we're at the World War stage yet, and hopefully we won't get there. But certainly, the reverberations of the war in Ukraine are very wide-ranging, and they do stretch around the world.
Jenny, thank you very much. That's Jenny Mathers there, and this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
This summer, visitors to beach clubs or bagni in Italy that occupy more than half of the country's coastline may be met with closed umbrellas, as operators have threatened to go on strike for 3 days in August. Despite it being the height of the season, owners will be closing down shop if the government does not resolve a complicated legal dispute with the EU around the lack of competition in the market. Many of these businesses are passed down through familial generations and subsequently have become an integral part of the makeup of the nation's beaches, making the debate particularly personal. Monocle's Monica Lillis sat down with deputy editor of Monocle's sister magazine, Confect, Chiara Ramella, to find out more. She started by asking her about why these concessions are so important to Italian culture.
Why is a difficult question to answer. It's just a historical reason. There are other countries around Europe where there's more of a tradition of free beaches. In Italy, so much of the coast is taken up by beach clubs, and people go back to the same beach club year after year. And historically, in past decades, this would have been very much the case when people weren't even travelling abroad very much. But certainly come August, the vast majority of people who live in cities in Italy will basically decamp to the beach for the best part of 2 weeks, if not more. Sometimes historically it would have been even more. And whilst there are free beaches, there are so many of these concessions across the coast, 30,000 to be precise. And they've always been a bit of an item of contention because they started off being let out, or these concessions were given for sometimes not very much money, but then over the course of the years, of course, this has become very, very, very big business. And I suppose the issue that people have with them is that they now make quite a lot of money when season comes, because obviously tourism is such an integral part of the Italian economy. And there are few, suspicions as to whether this process does allow for proper competition, because a lot of these concessions have historically been renewed automatically. And then more and more controversy around tax paying around all of this, and whether someone is eschewing the tax paying with this. Obviously this is a case-by-case type of scenario, but it's a type of business that is very much under the scrutiny of the larger, broader Italian society.
Yeah, absolutely. And something tricky is threatening their future at the moment. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, this is a long-standing dispute which began with the EU's kind of Bolkestein directive. So the idea is that the EU wants for competition to be injected into this side of Italian economy. But those who have concessions resist that because, to a certain extent, a lot of these businesses are actually family businesses. They've been passed down through the generations because the concessions have been renewed automatically. And lots of these, there's a big span in terms of what these businesses even are. Some are little huts on the beach, and some of them are like massive hotels with luxury restaurants. So the amount of money that they make is also different, and the amount of role that they have in looking after the beach themselves is also different. And a lot of them have invested a lot of money in creating these structures, maintaining the structures, maintaining the beach. You know, I was recently in Venice at the Lido. Not many people know that Venice has actually a functioning beach with lots of beach clubs, but there is on the other side of the lagoon facing the Adriatic. And I was there for a report that's currently out in Monocle Radio, actually. And again, like there is a wide variety of businesses that operate. One of them, Bagni, for example, I spoke at length about this issue with the manager there. And he was saying, you know, he takes care so much of the beach, you know, when there are storms, he clears it up. And the margins that he's making are not actually that big, but lots of people point fingers at him as being part of this wider category that's making the most of these historical advantages. People worry that they've spent all this money, all this energy for generations and generations, and now these concessions may be kind of snuffled out from underneath their feet because the competition would open up also to potential buyers outside of the Italian borders as well.
And so what does this then mean for, you know, if we're going to visit a coastal town in Italy this summer, what does it mean if the strikes then go ahead?
Well, it's not too bad, fortunately. You'll still be able to go for a swim. But the idea is that the bagni, the way that they're called in Italian, would shut down their umbrellas and their sunbeds for a few hours on 3 different dates across August, should the parliament not resolve this issue before they themselves go on parliamentary holiday break. So the planned strikes are for 2 hours one day, 4 hours another, 6 or 8 another. So long as it's not the center hours of the day, bring plenty of sunscreen, you might be fine. But it's more, I think, a symbolic act. I mean, this is the height of high season in Italy. It's such a lucrative time for the bagni to be making this choice now. They're really trying to make a point because at this point in time, it's when they'll be charging the most for their umbrellas. So it's very, very precious territory to be giving up.
And naturally, that will then put quite a lot of pressure on Meloni's government, I assume.
Yeah, you know, this is actually a category that's very tricky to manage. It's a long-standing dispute, and Meloni finds herself stuck between the EU and this specific kind of business category. And I think Meloni herself has been so keen to prove that she has a reputation and she's trustworthy on the European stage, even if this might sound like a very specific niche part of business. It's not really. It's really, really big money. And she wants to look credible on a European stage, so she can't really just pretend that this isn't happening. A lot of governments before her have just been trying to resolve the issue, but just extending the concessions by a few years at a time. And a previous 5-star movement government had tried to extend the concessions until 2033. And then that regulation had been overturned at European level, and there have been attempts at deciding to stop renewing them and then just extending them again. And there is an option in which she might try to just extend them by a few years, but will that really resolve anything? Probably not. It's just kicking the can down the road, and this problem will have to be resolved at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And just finally, is there a solution? Do people in Italy, do they want more free beaches, or is there somewhere we can meet in the middle on this?
I don't think that the issue is that they would become free beaches because they would just kind of change hands. It's more an issue of who makes the money and how much money is made. I think something that may make those who do manage these concessions now feel a bit better is the idea that there might be some compensation should these concessions be taken away from them, some compensation for the level of investment they've put into the properties, because sometimes because of the nature of the regulation, they might even just be taken from them despite all of the money that they've put into building actual buildings on these beaches. So long as there is some sort of regulatory platform around that, they might be a bit swayed. Even then, it's a bit of a loggerheads, and it looks like someone's going to have to win out over the other party here.
And that was Chiara Romella, who's Confex deputy editor, speaking to Monica Lillis. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. finally, let's head to Paris, to where Monocle has decamped to bring you 2 weeks of live radio. In just a few minutes, Monocle's Emma Nelson will be here to bring you today's Monocle in Paris. And she joins me now from Maison Alliance in Paris to speak about what's coming up on your show in a moment. Before we do that, Emma, I understand you've actually been allowed out from your glass box. You've been to an event.
Bonjour. Very nice to hear you once again, Georgina, for a little check-in before we go live with Monocle in Paris in the next few minutes. If you're listening live to The Globalist, stay tuned. We've got a nice little hour coming up. But yes, you are right. The whole Monocle Radio Paris team was sent on a little bit of a school trip last night. We went to the football. And while the rest of the world was making its focus on, I don't know, the Olympic swimming or the gymnastics, we thought, no, we're going to go to watch Mali-Paraguay. And actually, I'm joined by Monocle's Carlotta Rebello. And it was an absolute, well, it was as we expected it to be, wasn't it, Carlotta?
Definitely how I expected it to be. I was Team Paraguay through and through, but Emma...
You were a bunch of thugs last night.
Yeah, you on Team Mali. I don't know what your those antics were, but you spent more time on the floor rather than playing. Your players were injured the whole time. I don't know, Emma. I think Paraguay deservedly won last night.
Bunch of bullies. It was all right. It was super hot though. I mean, we've been baking. I mean, I can't tell you how hot it was in the stadium last night because we were at the Parc des Princes, which is Paris Saint-Germain's stadium. So that was super fun in itself. But we were up in the gods, and it was like being in, I don't know, it's sort of like being a sort of slightly stinky steam bath sauna. It was really, really, really difficult. It was delightful to go with Andrew Muller, who I can absolutely vouch for the fact that he does not do a Mexican wave, despite the fact that it kept going round and round and round. Anyway, do you want to know what's happening in the programme today?
I would really like to know that.
We've got a Paris in absolutely the swing of things. The Monocle regular Agnès Parrier is literally standing 10 feet from me, ready, poised to tell us how, as kind of we expected, a slightly hesitant and shaky and, dare I say, cynical start to the Paris Olympics has been brushed aside, swept aside by a total fever now. You can't get a ticket for love nor money. People are spending half of their times on the resale sites and contemplating whether €690 is a significant and an acceptable price to pay to watch a match of ping pong. We're going to be talking to a few post-Olympians as well, explaining how if you have had a career as a swimmer or an ice hockey player, how that prepares you for life outside and how you can inspire others and sort of get things going. So it's going to be quite a sort of a dynamic and sort of forward-looking programme today.
Mm-hmm. You must try and convince Agnès to show you her studio. It's got a little balcony that looks out over Notre Dame and it's absolutely exquisite.
Agnès, really... are you up for that? Yes, she says. We're going. Thanks, Georgina. Poor woman's going to be invaded by the Monocle team.
Exactly. You've got some very special guests, though.
We have. So talking about changes that are happening in the Olympics this year, the theme this year is parity, which means that for the first time, this is quite surprising, an equal number of men and women are competing in the Games. And so we're meeting two women, a former Olympian, Angela Ruggiero, and a fashion executive, Phoebe Mackay, who've come together and who are making sure that fashion and sport become sort of fused in the way that arguably they should be, especially for women, because for so long, men and fashion and sport have been, easily accepted and is subsumed into the way that our culture wears. I mean, how many people have got a pair of Nike Air Jordans, for example, or Stan Smith trainers? But they're trying to make sure that women's names start to appear on, sort of mainstream sports brands as well. Mm-hmm. And also, I think we have to mention very briefly that we're talking to a man called Alexander Galimberti. He is going to be talking to us about a winter pentathlon that happens in St. Moritz, which invites people who are not necessarily Olympians. In fact, they're amateurs, but they're still super duper at what they do. So Georgina, it may have been tipping down here in Paris for the last 12 hours, but it's still hot. Nonetheless, I'm going to get everybody to get their salopettes on in time for the programme.
Absolutely. Emma, many thanks to you. And a big hello to everybody that's there in the studio. We miss you. Hi, Agnès. Hi, Carlotta. And we'll be hearing from you in Paris very shortly. And that's all we have time for on today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Angelica Jobson, Chris Chermak and Monica Lillis. Our researcher, Sana Jimani, and our studio manager, Lily Austin. Now, as we've been saying, coming up at the top of the hour, our third edition of Monocle in Paris. Then I'll be back with you on The Briefing, that's live at midday, and indeed back with you on The Globalist, which returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.